The letter of appointment lay on the mahogany desk between them like a document awaiting its inquest, and Octavia noted, without allowing the observation to alter her expression, that the Duke of Ashburn had not offered her a chair. The morning was November cold in that particular Devonshire way, where the cold does not arrive so much as reside, having never truly departed, and the study received it through 3 tall windows, whose curtains someone had drawn back to admit the gray light, but not, apparently, the warmth of any human consideration. A fire burned in the grate to the Duke's left. He stood beside it. Octavia stood at the desk. The arrangement had not been discussed. William Ashburn was perhaps 40, or perhaps 38, or perhaps some age that authority had stretched into a permanent middle distance. He was not tall in the way men announce their height. He was tall in the way a closed door is tall, functional and unhurried. His hands were clasped at his back. He did not look at the letter, which bore his own seal. He looked at Octavia in the manner of a man examining an invoice he has not yet decided to pay. "The locked wing," he said. "The east corridor and its 4 associated rooms. The contents are to be catalogued in preparation for sale. The estate agent has advised a full appraisal." He paused. "I was told you came with a recommendation from Hatchard's." "From Sotheby's," Octavia said, "and from the executors of the Penhaligon estate in Cornwall." He did not acknowledge the correction. "The wing has been closed for 11 years. Whatever is in it will require sorting from what is merely old and what may be valuable. I suspect most of it is neither." There was something beneath the politeness that was not quite rudeness, but was the near neighbor of it, the assumption that her judgment would confirm his own dismissal of the contents, that she was being engaged not to appraise but to validate. Octavia had met this assumption before. She let it stand. She would not spend energy correcting what events would correct more thoroughly. "I will need access to the existing household inventory records," she said. "Whatever documentation covers the wing's contents prior to its being locked. It will allow me to establish provenance and note any discrepancies." William looked at her then with a degree of attention he had not previously offered. It was slight, a degree, not a revolution, the way a compass needle shifts when something magnetic passes. "I will have my steward, Mr. Fallow, provide whatever documents exist." He took up the letter of appointment and placed it to one side. "The position is temporary. You will lodge in the house during the work. Mrs. Peel will show you your room." He said this in the manner of a man concluding a transaction. "I would expect the work to take 3 weeks. It may take longer," Octavia said. "Depending on condition." 3 weeks, he said again, not as a negotiation but as a description of how time would behave in his house. She took up her own copy of the agreement, folded it along its existing crease, and placed it in her coat pocket. Then she looked at him once, directly, with the particular quality of stillness that had, over the years of her work, become her most honest expression, not blankness, not submission, but the face of a person who has already gathered more than the room suspects and is content to wait. William Ashburn looked back at her, and whatever he expected to find in that look, an apology for her correction, a deference, a flicker of anxiety, he did not find it. He did not name what he found instead. The fire shifted in the grate and sent one bright lick of light across the wall. Mrs. Peel, who had been standing near the door with the complete stillness of a woman who had learned to be furniture in this house, moved forward to collect Octavia and carry her out of the room. Octavia went. She did not look back at William Ashburn, and she did not need to. She had already taken his measure, in the way she took the measure of every closed room she was asked to enter, carefully, quietly, and without announcing the result. She had been dismissed into the house he kept locked. He would not understand what that meant until much later. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you have settled in, and the light is low, and you have nowhere pressing to be, then this story is ready for you. What follows is an account of a falsified ledger, a locked door, and the particular kind of patience it takes to outlast a man who has never once considered being wrong. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated somewhere you knew exactly what you were doing? I would very much like to know. Mrs. Peel led her down 2 corridors, up a half staircase, and into a room at the northeast corner of the house, where the bed was made with military precision, and the window looked out over what had once been a kitchen garden, and was now mostly frost-hardened ground, with the skeletal remnants of espaliered pear trees still attached to the south wall, like old letters no one had thought to take down. The room smelled of dried lavender and a faint mineral damp that suggested the window frame needed repointing. Octavia set her case on the floor rather than the bed, which she always did in other people's houses, and stood at the window for 1 minute and 12 seconds, which was her habit when entering a new space, not from sentiment, but from the discipline of first observation. The kitchen garden below had been abandoned approximately 8 years ago, she estimated, based on the degree of self-seeding in the beds and the advanced state of the yew hedging that bordered it to the north. The house itself was in reasonable external repair, which meant the neglect was selective rather than total. Someone had decided certain things mattered, and certain things did not. The kitchen garden was in the second category. The east wing, locked 11 years past, was presumably in the second category also. She unpacked her working case with the methodical care she brought to all physical tasks. Her notebooks first, 3 of them, 1 for the object record, 1 for the condition notes, 1 for what she privately called the questions, meaning the observations that did not yet have sufficient evidence for conclusions. Then her measuring tape, her magnifying glass, her reference cards, her typographer's loupe for examining marks and signatures on silver and ceramics. She laid them on the small writing desk in the order she would use them. This was not fussiness. This was the preparation of a person who knew that the first 30 minutes in a new inventory could establish the shape of every working hour that followed. Mr. Fallow delivered the household records the following morning at 7:45, which told Octavia he had not wanted to bring them, but had not wished to be seen refusing. He was a man somewhere past 50 who smiled with the lower half of his face only, and who set the records on the writing desk with a lightness of touch that suggested he would have preferred to set them on fire. They were 3 bound volumes and a loose sheaf of handwritten addenda, and their condition was poor, not with the honest poor condition of use, but with the particular slightly sticky dishevelment of records that have been handled often, and not by archivists. His Grace mentioned you would want these, Fallow said. Most of it's routine inventory from the previous decade. The East Wing section is toward the back of the second volume. Thank you, Octavia said. She did not open the volumes until he had left. When she did open them, she began as she always began, with the section on silver, specifically the hallmarked silver recorded by weight and piece count, because silver records were almost impossible to falsify without leaving traces in the mathematics, and she had found over the course of 9 years and 43 estate appraisals that when the silver was wrong, most other things were wrong also. The East Wing silver was documented in 37 entries across 11 pages of the second volume. She read each entry in the manner of someone reading not for content but for rhythm, for the places where the rhythm broke. It took her 40 minutes. Then she placed her pencil flat across the open page, a habit she had when something required the particular quality of stillness that thinking demanded. She looked at the window, where the frozen kitchen garden sat in the watery December light. One of the pear tree branches moved in a wind she could not hear through the glass. 37 entries. But the internal cross-references between entries, the notations that linked a piece recorded in one year to its reappearance in a later year's revaluation, produced not 37 distinct objects but 41 in some calculations and 33 in others. a spread of 8 pieces that appeared and disappeared according to no logic of sale, loan, or loss, and none of the discrepancies were noted. In 9 years of appraising, she had seen accidental errors produce spreads of 1 or 2, 3 occasionally, in very old or very poorly kept records. 8 was not an accident. She opened the third notebook, the one for questions, and wrote her first entry without accusation or conclusion, simply 3 columns: what the record claimed, what the arithmetic produced, and the difference. Then she rose, put on her coat, and went down to the east wing with the ring of keys Mrs. Peel had silently provided the previous evening. The lock was a lever mechanism Chubb from approximately 1889, and it opened on the third key with the solid click of a thing that had waited patiently and was prepared to perform its function. The door swung inward. The smell that came from the corridor beyond was the smell of all closed rooms, the smell of time folded over itself, dust and wax and the faint sweet rot of old upholstery and wood, whose moisture had been leaving for years in the absence of any fire. It was not an unpleasant smell to Octavia. It was the smell of work waiting. She stepped inside and pulled the door nearly closed behind her. The light from the high, north-facing windows at the corridor's far end was low and blue and made everything look slightly submerged. She walked the full length of the corridor without touching anything, 43 feet, and counted 4 doors and 1 larger set of double doors at the corridor's end. Then she went back to the entrance and began again from the beginning, this time slowly, and with her notebook open. She did not take her magnifying glass. Not yet. Not on the first pass. The first pass was for listening. The wing held what neglected houses always held, the furniture of lives interrupted, but it held it with an unusual density, as though the rooms had been filled and then sealed in a single action, rather than allowed to accumulate naturally over time. There were picture frames stacked against one wall with their faces turned inward, which is not how pictures are usually stored. As any appraiser knows, facing in risks damage to the surfaces. There was a vitrine cabinet against the far wall of the first room, its glass intact, whose contents Octavia could already see, contained a quantity of gilt metal objects that would require careful attribution. The furniture was draped in Holland cloth so old it had taken on the gray of the walls. None of it had been catalogued in the records she had just read. None of it appeared in the East Wing section of Volume 2 at all. She noted this in the questions notebook without exclamation and without rushing, in her small, even hand, the handwriting of someone who has learned that the legibility of a record is a moral quality. Then she closed the notebook, walked back to the entrance, and locked the door again. She had what she needed for today, which was the knowledge that the room held more than the inventory claimed, and that someone, at some point and with some deliberate purpose, had made certain it would not be found unless someone came and found it. Someone had come. The story must go back now, before it can go forward. It must go back approximately 14 years, to a house in Wiltshire that no longer stands in the form Octavia knew it, to the workshop behind the main house, where a man named Edmund Voss, who was her father's elder brother and the person who had effectively raised her from the age of 11, kept his working table clear of everything but the object currently under examination. Edmund had been a furniture and decorative arts expert of the old school, which meant he had learned his craft by handling 6,000 objects before he was permitted to form a written opinion on the 7,000th. And he had extended this same courtesy to Octavia's education, without asking whether she wanted it. She had wanted it. This was the fact the story requires. Her mother had died when Octavia was 10, not dramatically but steadily, of the kind of illness that does not announce itself as fatal until it has already become so, and her father, who was a man of genuine feeling and no practical organization, had placed her with Edmund in Wiltshire, while he sorted his grief into some manageable order. Edmund had 3 large rooms given over entirely to reference works, 800 catalogs, 20 years of auction records, monographs on gilding and japanning, and the turning of chair legs. He had assumed Octavia would find the books interesting. She had found them insufficient and had gone directly to the workshop and begun handling the objects, which Edmund had noticed and had, after 1 week, permitted. She had remained in Wiltshire for 4 years. Her father had settled his grief well enough to come for her at the end of the 2nd year, but Octavia had declined to go, in the particular polite and immovable way that was already, at 13, her most reliable mode, and her father, who understood that she was becoming something his household could not have produced, had not pressed the point. By the time she was 16, she could examine a piece of furniture and give Edmund a terminus post quem, the earliest date the object could have been made, by its construction details, its secondary woods, its tool marks. By 18, she could attribute silver by its assay marks and the style of its maker's punch, cross-referenced against the London Hall mark records. By 20, she had completed formal training and acquired a position at a London firm that appraised estates. She had lost Edmund at 22. He died in October of a year that was already cold early, sitting in the workshop at his working table, with a chair leg he had been examining for evidence of period conversion on the table before him, and his hands folded in his lap in the specific way that meant he had finished and was content. She had been in Hampshire when it happened, cataloguing the contents of a baronet's library, and she learned of it by letter 3 days after the fact and wept precisely once, in the garden of the house she was staying in the dark, without witnesses, for approximately 10 minutes, and then had returned to the library and finished the work. Edmund would have found the weeping entirely appropriate and the returning entirely correct, and she had done it for both of them. Her grief had done what Edmund's training had done. It had gone in. Edmund had left her the 800 reference catalogs, the monograph collection, and a letter that said, in its entirety, "The objects will tell you. Listen to them more carefully than you listen to the people who own them. The people are interested parties. The objects are only themselves." This advice was not meant as poetry. It was meant, as Edmund meant everything, as a technical instruction, and Octavia had carried it into every locked room she had since entered. She had entered 43 such rooms by the time Ashburn's letter of appointment found her in a modest office in London, where she practiced independently and had for the past 3 years since leaving the firm, not under duress but by preference, because her judgment and the firm's willingness to accommodate it had eventually diverged. She was 31. She had a reputation among solicitors and estate agents and executors of wills that was built entirely on the accuracy of her records and the fact that she had never, in 43 appraisals, produced an inventory that later proved materially incorrect. This reputation existed in a specific stratum of professional knowledge and nowhere else, which meant it was invisible to men like William Ashburn, who received their professional information through social channels, and who had engaged her because an estate agent had sent her name in a list of 3, and his secretary had noted she was the most economical. This too she knew, and did not mind. What she minded, in the careful way she allowed herself to mind things, was the falsified record, but that had not yet fully declared itself. It was still in the column of questions. She had 3 weeks, or longer, to allow it to become an answer. The village of Ashburn-under-Tor contained a post office, a public house, a church of the 12th century with a tower the 18th century had attempted to improve and failed, and a general shop whose proprietor, a Mrs. Sable, was the repository of all parish knowledge going back approximately 40 years. Octavia learned of Mrs. Sable on her 2nd full day in the house, when she walked the half-mile to the village to buy India ink, and found the shop also stocked notebooks of an adequate quality, which she purchased, and found Mrs. Sable herself standing behind the counter, with the self-containment of a woman who has made her peace with everyone in the parish, and found most of them wanting. "You'll be the appraiser they've sent for the house," Mrs. Sable said. She was 70 or near it, small, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades in small spaces and have learned not to waste effort on motion. "Yes," Octavia said. "The East Wing." "Yes." Mrs. Sable looked at her with the sustained attention of someone who has spent a long time reading people with limited information and has become accurate. "Fallow won't like that," she said. Octavia placed her notebooks on the counter and took out her purse. "Do you know why?" "Because Fallow has been running that estate for 15 years, Mrs. Sable said, "and in 15 years, nothing has ever been looked at that he did not want looked at." She accepted Octavia's money and made change with the precision of long practice. "That wing's been locked since the old Duke died. The previous one, William's father." She paused. "Word was there was some legal question about the contents, a disputed bequest. But nothing was ever settled one way or another, and then it was just locked, and Fallow said there was nothing in it worth mentioning." "Fallow said," Octavia said, in the particular neutral tone that was not quite a question. "He did," Mrs. Sable said. She placed the change on the counter rather than in Octavia's hand, and her eyes, which were dark and entirely awake, held a degree of quiet amusement at the situation, or possibly at Octavia herself. "Are you going to find something worth mentioning?" "I have already found several things worth mentioning," Octavia said. "Whether I can determine what they mean is a different matter." Mrs. Sable nodded, once, as though this confirmed something. Then she said, more quietly, "The old housekeeper, the one before Mrs. Peel. She was let go 3 months after the old Duke died. She'd been in the house 30 years. They said it was the change of household, the new Duke wanting his own arrangements. She lives in the cottage at the lane's end." She looked at Octavia. "She's called Mrs. Hartley. She doesn't leave the cottage much, but she answers the door." Octavia thanked her, took her notebooks and her ink, and left. The cold outside was a working cold, the kind that clarified rather than oppressed, and she walked back toward the house along the lane's verge with the particular briskness that came over her when the shape of a thing was beginning to be visible through its surface. Fallow, the locked wing, a dismissed housekeeper, a disputed bequest that had never been settled, and a silver record that spread across 8 impossible objects. 2 of the other village establishments declined Octavia's initial inquiries, which she made in the form of ordinary conversation rather than direct questions. The post office clerk, who was young and recently installed, knew nothing of the estate before his own time. The publican, a large man named Corin, was pleasant and told her 3 anecdotes about the old Duke that contained no useful information. Neither of these responses discouraged her. She had worked in enough closed communities to understand that useful information moved along its own channels and arrived in its own time. She had deposited herself into the network of the village, and the network would determine when she was ready to receive what it held. She returned to the wing in the afternoons, after her morning record work, and she was 4 days into the formal catalogue when she met, in the corridor outside the double doors, a young woman named Miss Rowe, who was the daughter of the estate's nearest tenant farmer, and who had been sent by her father, she said, to ask whether the appraiser required any additional labor for moving furniture. Octavia looked at Miss Rowe, who was perhaps 23, who had the reddened hands and direct gaze of someone unaccustomed to performing errands of this type, and who was holding herself with the particular carefulness of a person who has been told what to say and is hoping she says it correctly. "Tell your father I am grateful," Octavia said. "I may need assistance moving the vitrine cabinet in the first room when it comes time to examine its reverse. I will send word." Miss Rowe left, and then, a moment before she was quite out of hearing, Octavia said, "Miss Rowe." The young woman stopped. The cabinet in the first room. Do you know whether it was in the wing before it was locked, or whether it was placed there afterward? A silence in which Miss Rowe's expression went through several private calculations. I don't know for certain, she said, but my father says the wing was being used for storage even before the old Duke died. That things were moved in from other parts of the house. She paused. He says it happened over several years. Thank you, Octavia said. Things moved in, over several years, to a room being sealed, and then a steward who said there was nothing worth mentioning. She did not write this in any notebook, not yet. She held it in the way she held things that were not yet evidence, carefully, without weight. We are now deep enough into this story that I should thank you for staying. This is not the kind of story that resolves in haste, and you have understood that. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, I want to invite you to do that now, not as a matter of urgency, but as a way of continuing, because what comes next is the part where Octavia's patience and Fallow's accounting begin to arrive at the same point from opposite directions, and I would very much prefer you are present when they meet. We are almost at the moment when the Duke stops looking at Octavia the way he looks at invoices. It was in the second week that William Ashburn came to the East Wing. Octavia knew he had been receiving reports, because she had seen Fallow twice, standing in the corridor outside the wing's entrance at times, when there was no estate business to bring him there, and because 2 of the Holland cloths had been rearranged between one afternoon and the following morning, in a manner consistent with someone who had entered the room in the hours she was not present, and had not known how she'd left things. She noted this in the questions notebook and said nothing. When William came himself, it was a Wednesday at 11 in the morning, which was the time Octavia was in the first room conducting the formal examination of the vitrine cabinet's contents. He did not knock at the wing's door, which was, she supposed, his right. He walked the corridor at his usual pace and appeared in the doorway of the first room, and stood there, looking at the scene before him, which was the following. Octavia on her knees before the cabinet with its doors open, a piece of gilt metal candlestick in her hands, her typographer's loupe at her eye, and her object record notebook open beside her on the floor with entries in 3 columns. He looked at the notebook, the loupe, the candlestick, and then at her. She was aware of his looking in the way she was aware of most things in a working room, peripherally and accurately, and she did not lower the candlestick or remove the loupe. Candlestick, she said without preamble, because he was clearly waiting for her to say something and she had no interest in saying nothing on his behalf. Ormolu, probably Louis XVI period, possibly Dutch rather than French given the quality of the fire gilding. There are 9 pieces in this cabinet that carry no corresponding entry in the household inventory. This is one of them. A pause of perhaps 6 seconds. Fallow inventoried this wing. Yes, Octavia said. His inventory does not record these objects. Nor this cabinet. An oversight, William said, not a question. Not quite a statement either. The word of a man testing a surface before he commits his weight. An oversight, she said, would typically produce 1 or 2 missing entries. There are at present 31 objects in this wing not recorded in the household inventory. I have examined approximately 1/3 of the wing's contents. She set the candlestick down on the spread of cloth she used as a working surface, and removed the loupe and looked up at him for the first time since he had entered. He was standing with his hands at his sides rather than clasped at his back, which was, she had come to understand in 2 weeks of observation, the sign that he was uncertain. He was not accustomed to the feeling. 31, he said. At minimum, she said. She held his gaze, not with challenge, but with the patient absence of apology that had become her most economical instrument. When I have completed the examination of this wing, I will produce a full discrepancy report. The numbers may change. They are unlikely to decrease. A further silence, longer than the previous one, and with a different quality. Not his usual silence, which was the silence of a man who has already decided and is allowing the echo to settle. This was a silence in which something was being revised. Octavia watched it happen in the small muscles around his eyes and in the faint adjustment of his shoulders. Not a slouch. He would not slouch, but a slight release, as though the certainty he had carried into the room had shifted its position. "When did you notice?" he said, and then he stopped, and Octavia understood he had started a question and found that finishing it required naming what the question implied. "The first morning," she said. "The silver records." He stood for one more moment, and then he said, "I see," in the way that meant he did not yet see, but that he had understood seeing was required of him, which was perhaps a more honest statement than actual understanding would have been. He left, and Octavia turned back to the cabinet and picked up the candlestick again, and the gilt caught the winter light from the window, and she held the loupe in place and went on reading the object's surface for everything it was willing to tell. Secondary woods and hidden joints do not lie, Edmund had told her once. They are the only witnesses who were present at the origin. She had thought of it many times, in many rooms. She thought of it now, with the Duke's retreating footsteps quiet in the corridor, and 31 unrecorded objects arranged around her on the holland cloth. In the 4th day following William Ashburn's visit to the wing, Octavia went to the cottage at the lane's end and knocked at the door. Mrs. Hartley answered it in approximately 30 seconds, which was the response time of a person who moves efficiently, rather than slowly. She was 74 or 5, white-haired, with the hands of someone who had spent a professional lifetime in domestic management, and the eyes of someone who had decided, at some prior point, to waste no further goodwill on false courtesy. She looked at Octavia. She said nothing. "My name is Octavia," Octavia said. "I am appraising the estate. I have some questions about the East Wing's contents." "I know who you are," Mrs. Hartley said. "Come in." The cottage was exactly as a former housekeeper's cottage ought to be, which is to say scrupulously ordered and without a single item that was not functional or genuinely loved, and it smelled of wood ash and black tea, and the cedar oil one uses to keep old furniture in condition. Mrs. Hartley made tea without asking whether Octavia wanted it and set it on the table and sat down. "There are objects in that wing," Octavia said, "that carry no corresponding record in the household inventory. Approximately 45 by my current count, ranging from silver plate and gilt metalwork through to 2 pieces of Venice Martin lacquer furniture, and a small oil painting that may be Dutch school, 17th century. None of this is recorded." "No," Mrs. Hartley said, "it wouldn't be." "Why not?" Mrs. Hartley held her teacup in both hands. "Because Mr. Fallow told me, in the month after the old Duke died, that the wing was being locked for legal reasons, and that its contents were to be left off the household record until the legal matter was settled. He said the Duke, meaning the young one, meaning the one you're working for now, had instructed it." She set the cup down. "I thought it was strange. I said so, and 3 months later I was given my notice." A silence between them. "Did you believe the instruction came from the current Duke?" Octavia asked. Mrs. Hartley looked at her with the quality of patient scorn that belongs to people who have seen exactly this kind of thing before. "William Ashburn was 22 when his father died," she said. "He was in Edinburgh finishing his legal studies. He'd barely set foot in the house for 2 years. He didn't know what was in the wing any more than you did when you arrived." She paused. "Fallow knew. Did you keep any record of what was in the wing before it was locked?" A long pause. Mrs. Hartley rose, went to the room's small writing desk, opened a lower drawer, and withdrew a notebook, not modern, its boards cloth-covered, its edges worn, the handwriting inside, in the careful round script of a woman who took records seriously. She set it on the table before Octavia. "I kept my own inventory," she said. "I kept one every year. It was my habit. Fallow never asked to see it." She looked at the notebook. I have one from the year before the old Duke died. It includes the East Wing." Octavia looked at the notebook for the particular 2 or 3 seconds she always allowed herself before opening something she understood to be significant. Then she opened it. 61 objects in the East Wing, listed by room, with Mrs. Hartley's careful descriptions and occasional valuations, sourced from the auction records she had apparently consulted. 61 objects, against the 45 Octavia had so far found, and the 0 recorded by Fallow. The mathematics of the discrepancy had just changed. It was in the final days of the second week that Fallow moved. Octavia had expected something, because the particular pressure that had been building in his small smiles and his unnecessary visits to the corridor outside the wing had to translate eventually into action, and she had made a habit of ensuring her working notebooks were secured in her room each evening, and that she had produced copies of her key findings on plain paper, which she had dispatched by post to her London solicitor with a covering letter that noted the date and her current situation. She had also, on a Thursday afternoon, invited William Ashburn to the wing, not to report but to show, which was a different thing. He came. She led him through the catalogued first room and showed him the 37 objects now laid on the cloth in groups by type, each with its reference card in her handwriting, its description, its estimated period, its assessment of condition. She showed him the second room, the Vernus Martin pieces, their lacquered surfaces still vivid under the dust, recording a chinoiserie of birds and pavilions in the manner of the 1730s, and entirely absent from any record. She showed him the oil painting, approximately 14 inches by 18, in its original frame, a coastal scene in the manner of the Dutch Italianates, unsigned but bearing a collector's mark on its reverse, that she had photographed and cross-referenced, and which matched a collector whose provenance she could trace. William said very little. He put his hands, which he now left at his sides in her presence by what appeared to be a deliberate choice, behind his back once, when she showed him the Dutch painting, and then brought them forward again. He looked at the objects as she described them with a focus she recognized as genuine, as the attention of a man who has understood that he is looking at something his own house contained, and his own employee chose to hide. "The bequest," he said, when they were back in the corridor. "My father left a letter with his will that mentioned objects to be given to the Ashburn Parish Church, historical items of interest." He spoke precisely, in the manner of a man reporting facts rather than feelings. The solicitor at the time said there were no such objects, that the wing contained nothing applicable. The solicitor at the time, Octavia said, was presumably provided with the inventory. "By Fallow," William said. "Yes," Octavia said. Another silence of the revised kind. "What is the total estimated value," he asked, "of what you have found so far?" "I will have a figure when I have examined everything," she said. "Preliminarily, and without guaranteeing accuracy at this stage, I would say the wing contains objects whose combined value at auction would be considerable. The Dutch painting alone, if the attribution holds, could command a significant sum." He looked at the corridor, at the closed doors, at the hanging light. "What did Fallow take?" he said quietly, as though saying it aloud for the first time. "That I cannot tell you," she said. "I can tell you what the wing holds now, and what Mrs. Hartley's inventory says it held before it was locked. The difference between those two accounts is 16 objects. Whether those objects were removed before or after the wing was sealed, and by whom, is a question for different authorities than myself." She paused. "Though I note that the answer is in Fallow's paperwork, if one looks carefully enough." William looked at her. "You have looked," he said. "I have looked," she said. She did not tell him what she had found in the purchase records, the maintenance accounts, the small private transactions in Fallow's own handwriting where pieces described as disposed of for repairs had in fact been sold. She had traced 2 of them to a dealer in Exeter whose business records her London solicitor was now examining. She did not tell him this because the moment had not yet come, and because the moment, when it came, required all of its evidence assembled, not parceled out in anticipation. What happened on the Thursday of the third week was not what Fallow had intended, though his intention was clear enough. He entered the wing in the early morning, before Octavia had come down from her room, and he moved 4 of the reference cards from their objects and substituted different descriptions, apparently written the previous evening, in a hand that approximated but did not replicate Octavia's own. He then went about his morning's business with the half-smile of a man who has resolved a problem. Octavia arrived at 7:30, looked at the 4 reference cards and set them quietly to one side without disturbing anything else. She had written the originals in her notebooks. The notebooks were in her room. The substituted cards were now evidence of something quite different from what Fallow had intended them to be. She sent for William at 9 o'clock. She did not send a dramatic message. She sent a note, in her plain hand, saying she had something he would wish to see. He came at 9:40, still in his riding coat from his morning, which was the only sign he had altered his plans to come sooner rather than later. He looked at the 4 substituted cards. He looked at Octavia's originals, which she had placed beside them. He looked at the handwriting. He looked at Octavia. "Fallow did this," he said, not a question. "The cards are not in my handwriting," she said. "The originals, which match my notebook entries, are. You may compare them." He compared them. A long, quiet minute. His hands were still. His face did not change in any large sense. Only the particular alignment of his eyes turned slightly downward toward the cards, with a quality of reckoning that she had seen on the faces of people encountering something they had chosen not to know and now could no longer choose. "I am sorry," he said. It arrived in 5 words, quietly, without preamble, without the apparatus of explanation. He was not apologizing only for Fallow. She understood this, and did not rush to accept it, but let the 5 words be what they were. "The commission is nearly complete," she said. "When it is, you will have a full inventory of what this wing holds, a discrepancy report against the historical records, and a documented account of the alterations made to my working notes. Your solicitor will know what to do with the last of those." "Yes," William said. He was still looking at the cards. Then, with the deliberate quality of a decision made rather than discovered, "You said it might take longer than 3 weeks. "It will take another week," she said. "Possibly 10 days. "Yes," he said again. And then, "Whatever time you require." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and what passed between them in that look was not quite named by either of them, and would not be named for some time yet. But it was the first look in which neither of them was performing a previous certainty, and the corridor was very still, and somewhere in the house a door opened and closed on a cold wind. Fallow was summoned to William's study on a Tuesday morning, 4 days before Octavia's formal report was complete. She was not in the room. She did not need to be. The summons was issued and the interview was conducted, from what she understood from Mrs. Peel's careful neutral face afterward, with the particular quiet of a man who does not raise his voice because he does not need to, and whose accounting, when he finally lays it on a desk, is precise enough to require no elaboration. Fallow left the estate that afternoon. He did not say goodbye to anyone. Mrs. Peel watched him go from the upper landing with the expression of someone seeing a thing conclude that has been a long time in its concluding. The Exeter dealer, whose name was Grint, was interviewed by William's solicitor and William's legal agent on the following Wednesday. Octavia had provided the provenance chain for 2 of the 16 missing objects, a pair of silver gilt comports that Mrs. Hartley's inventory described specifically enough for identification, and which Grint's records, viewed under the particular persuasion that comes from having a solicitor present, confirmed he had purchased from a private individual in 1902, whose description matched Fallow precisely. The comports had been sold on to a private collector in Bristol, who was contacted and who had not known their provenance and was disposed under the circumstances to cooperate. They were returned to Ashburn within 6 weeks. 2 of 16 objects. 14 remained unaccounted for, and it was possible they always would. Octavia noted this in her final report without editorializing. In the plain language of a professional document, 14 objects recorded in the 1900 household inventory of Mrs. Hartley remain unlocated, and their disposition is unknown. The discrepancy is documented and preserved for any further inquiry that may be pursued by the estate's legal representatives. She did not write what she privately knew, which was that Fallow had been operating across a period of years, that the operation had begun in the last years of the old Duke's declining health, and that the disputed bequest, the letter asking that historical items be given to the parish church, had not been an oversight in the settlement of the will, but a direct threat to Fallow's arrangement, which was why the wing had been sealed and its contents suppressed. She knew this. She had enough of it in documents to support the knowledge. She set out what the documents proved and no more. The parish church received in December of that year a donation from the Ashburn estate consisting of 4 pieces from the east wing that William's solicitor assessed as historically appropriate to the bequest. A pair of silver candlesticks of the 1780s, a small reliquary cross of uncertain but evidently early provenance, and a framed document bearing the signatures of 2 of the estate's former holders. The donation was made quietly, without ceremony. Octavia was present, because William asked her to attend as the appraiser who had established the object's legitimacy. She stood in the church with the December cold pressing at the windows, and watched the vicar receive the pieces with a gravity that matched their age. William stood beside her, not near, not crowding, but beside, in the way that felt like a choice rather than a coincidence. He had been doing this in the preceding weeks, appearing beside her rather than across from her, standing at her left rather than facing her from a position of height, as though the architecture of his own behavior was being quietly altered from within. She had noticed it the way she noticed things, peripherally and accurately, and she had not commented on it. The church was cold and the candles were lit, and the silver of the candlesticks caught the light in that particular way that old silver catches light, not brilliantly but warmly, with the depth of accumulated handling. She thought of Edmund, who had told her that objects hold the warmth of the hands that have touched them, not literally, not scientifically, but in the way that use and time and making are held in the material itself. She thought he would have liked this room. "You could have used what you found to do considerably more damage," William said, quietly, not looking at her but at the vicar, who was examining the reliquary with appropriate reverence. To Fallow, certainly, but to the estate as well. "I found what was there," she said. "The damage was already done. My job was to establish the record, not to extend the harm." A silence. Then, "You are not what I expected." She allowed this to rest for a moment. "What did you expect?" He did not answer immediately, and when he did, the answer was accurate enough to credit him. "Someone who would tell me what I wanted to know." "Appraisers do not do that," she said, "not the good ones." He turned then and looked at her, and she looked back at him, in the cold candle-lit air of the church, with the silver warm on the altar, and the winter pressing at the windows, and the look had between them was the look of 2 people who have come to the same room by entirely different routes, and found, with some surprise, that the room suits them both. He did not say anything further, and she did not require him to. Edmund had told her that the objects were only themselves, and that this was their virtue. She had thought, privately and for some time, that the same might be said of people when they finally permitted it. Miss Rowe's father sent a note the following week asking whether Octavia intended to remain in the area, as there was a farmhouse on the estate's southern boundary that had been empty, and was available if she required premises from which to conduct an independent practice. She read the note twice, folded it, and placed it on the writing desk. Then she looked out at the kitchen garden, which had been cleared of its worst growth in November by a groundsman, and in which the old pear trees against the south wall were beginning, barely visibly, to form the small, tight buds that precede everything. She wrote back to say she would consider it. William's answer to the same question, which he asked in the library on a Friday evening when the fire was lit and the room smelled of paper and timber, and the cold that pressed around all the warmth they had managed to produce between them, was not a sentence but a pause, and then a hand extended across the small distance between two chairs, and Octavia looked at it for the specific moment that honest consideration requires, and then she took it, and his hand closed over hers and stayed. "The objects tell you," Edmund had said. "Listen to them more carefully than you listen to the people who own them." She had listened. She had found the record. She had set the record straight. And now, in the warm room, with the cold beyond the glass and the fire between them and the whole quiet house around them, she permitted herself the thought that this, too, was a thing worth appraising, the particular value of something that had been locked away and brought, finally, into the light. The pear trees by April would show their blossoms, and the kitchen garden would be productive within a season or two, and the east wing stood open now, its contents catalogued and returned to the household record where they belonged, and Octavia's notebooks were arranged on the shelf of the room she had taken as her own, and the winter was still very much present but had, in the way of winters that have been properly attended to, begun to lose its certainty. "The objects are only themselves," Edmund had said, "and sometimes that is enough. Thank you for staying with this story to its very end. I want to know where in the world you are watching from, and what this story of a locked room and a falsified ledger, and a woman who listened more carefully than anyone expected made you feel. Leave it in the comments, please. I do read them, and they matter more than you might think. If you have not subscribed, this is the moment I would ask you to consider it, not as an obligation, but as an acknowledgement that stories like this one, told at this pace, are worth continuing. And I want to leave you with one question to carry with you. Has there been something in your own life that was locked away longer than it should have been? And what did it mean when the door was finally opened?